Hello and welcome once again to episode 46 of Code Completion. We're a group of iOS developers and educators hoping to share what we love most about development, Apple technology, and completing your code. My name is Dimitri and I'll be your host once again for this episode, and I'm joined today by my fellow completionist, Spencer.
Hey there.
Fernando.
Hello, hello.
And Ben.
Hey, hey.
So before we get into our topics, it's time for our Indie App Spotlight. Today we are checking out Jelly Cuts by Zachary Lineman, an iPhone and iPad app that makes it easy to create powerful system shortcuts. So Jelly Cuts allows coders to get the most out of shortcuts by allowing you to write shortcuts in the Jelly language instead of messing around with the clunky UI, giving you a natural environment for creatively bringing different parts of the system together. Jelly Cuts is completely free to try and has a pay-what-you-want model with one-time in-app purchases ranging from $2.99 to $19.99. So if you've ever wanted to dive into shortcuts, please be sure to support Zachary by checking out Jelly Cuts. And if you are an indie developer, we want to hear from you. Please reach out to us on Twitter at Code Completion via DM so we can spotlight your app into the future as well. So today we thought we'd do a bit of a deep dive on SwiftUI, sharing our experiences with it along the way. And if I remember correctly, of the bunch of us, Fernando was actually the first to use SwiftUI for something. And specifically, that something was writing the SwiftUI lesson we taught Lambda. So why don't you share your thoughts on SwiftUI?
Hello, thank you. Yes, actually, yeah, that's a funny story. We're all ex-Lambda here. I remember we were talking about SwiftUI, up and coming, blah blah blah, and Ben, who was our boss, basically said, "Any of you guys want to do like a lesson on SwiftUI?" And I was like, "Sure, that's got to be the easiest thing ever."
Famous last words, right?
Yeah, was I naive or what? But I started out the lesson. It was a relatively simple. I remember I got. You all know how I'm just rambling. Oh my god, so many memories. You all remember how difficult it is to create lessons, right? You're like,
yes.
This is going to be like 30 minutes, and then it ends up being 5 hours. And then those 5 hours are basically 15 minutes of explanation, and you're like, oh my God, please. And then you give the class, and it's not 15 minutes, it's actually like 55. Yes. So it's like all weird and stuff. Yes. But I remember going through SwiftUI, and I was like, this is neat. Like, I remember, I probably may have the project somewhere, I don't remember. But it was just displaying a list, explaining like, generics, opaque types, the difference between UIKit and SwiftUI, how to like wrangle the data from like an API request to a model or view model, which will be a fun conversation in a bit, and then just displaying it in class. But then I also remember, and Dimitri's being very humble here, I remember being at like done 90%. And then being like, oh, damn, like the next 90% is just going to kill me. And so Dimitri came in and rescued me by helping with the second 90% of the lesson. And overall, I had a really good time with SwiftUI. It was, I think I was still in the honeymoon phase, and the example was very simple. So overall, I was like, this is really cool. The one thing I remember that I was like, is that it used to be that if you didn't have the lazy keyword on a list, it would basically generate the whole list regardless of the amount of items, right? So if you had like 10,000 items, you would get like 10,000 views right off the get-go, and scrolling would be very slow.
That's for the stacks, not the list.
Oh, okay.
The list is lazy.
Well, now you've ousted me. I haven't used SwiftUI since then. No, I used it a little bit to play with widgets, but then it just like disappeared from my life. So, but I remember that lazy gate event being like, this is kind of interesting in the not great kind of way. So,
and for those of you who may not have ever written like programming related curriculum before, it is actually true that there is a second 90% of work that you have to do to finish a lessons. planning,
Yeah.
it's surprising, but somehow he manages to fit that whole second 90% in there.
So yeah, I mean, in the end, I'm really interested in like hearing from you guys, because I know I know for sure that you have more experience than I do on SwiftUI. Especially Dimitri, I think you're the one that's been using SwiftUI the most, right?
Yeah, so I've been living on SwiftUI for the past year, I would say, and I haven't touched UIKit in forever, which is pretty funny because very recently I've had to dive back into UIKit, and the last time I wrote UIKit code was in Objective-C, so automatically I start putting in my square brackets, and the compiler is like, what are you doing?
We don't like the Marvel meme. We don't do that here.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but tell us a little bit more, like what the impressions that I have from SwiftUI. Let's start off with the fun stuff, in my opinion. The impressions that I have from SwiftUI is that I don't want to use it, because
Why? So give us a why. What specifically about it?
We need a user story.
I just need
Objectionable,
I need a user story. That'd be brilliant. I just need the kids at Cupertino to get off my lawn and just come up with like a UI app kit framework that works. I don't want to learn Catalyst. I don't want to learn SwiftUI. I just want to build UI without like having to worry about stuff.
So let's start
That's my
with
old
what,
man take. Sorry, what?
Let's start with what makes SwiftUI really great,
Awesome.
and then we can slowly back up towards the dangerous aspects of like using it for everything and then it not fitting for everything.
Perfect.
So SwiftUI is really excellent when you need to make a custom view. So if you've ever needed to do custom view drawing and then you start getting into the weeds of draw rect and drawing your strings and manually calculating where things are going to lay out, or putting many smaller labels together and kind of coordinating them all together, that gets really messy with UIKit, but it's really simple to do with SwiftUI. Namely, it gives you some very basic layout primitives, an HStack and a VStack, and there's no cost to nesting these as many times as you need to. And that's really powerful because you can go ahead and visually see exactly what you're going to get as you're typing these stacks out, as you're modifying the spacing, as you're tweaking the line height of one text element compared to another. You don't have to build and run to see, oh, one more pixel down. Oh, I guess it was half a pixel. And then you kind of do that over and over again. You don't have to do that iteration with the simulator or device. You can go ahead and do it directly in Xcode. And oftentimes it doesn't have to recompile anything. It will just notice that you've changed the parameter on something and you can go ahead and see the result immediately. So I think that's where SwiftUI really, really excels, is those small, very isolated components that you can go ahead and reuse perhaps everywhere, not only on the iOS side, but if you have a Mac app on the Mac side, on tvOS, on the watch, in the widgets. You can go ahead and reuse a lot of those components that are very simple and boiled down, and it's a pretty good solution and pretty good replacement for Interface Builder in that aspect.
I will say that I have seen a ton of like GIFs, tutorials, and just videos of like people building some like insanely complex UI on SwiftUI, and the constant feeling that I get when I watch one of those videos or images is like, how are they doing it? Because I envision trying to do it on a UIKit or AppKit, and it's like, whoa, that would take me like a ton of time to just build that. So
Yeah,
I can see that.
As a concrete example, I spent the better part of the last year in SwiftUI as well. And I just actually was building a lesson for a little class that I'm teaching for Underdog Devs, which is an organization that Fernando and I are involved with, an iOS lesson, and we're doing it in UIKit. And so I haven't touched UIKit in quite a long time. And so I'm building this little lesson, and I'm just trying to design a custom cell in a table view, nothing too fancy. And I'm doing it, and I'm like, Oh yeah, so I have to I start putting the stuff into the storyboard cell, right? And then I start to kind of like add some rules, and then it gets all wonky, and then I get red errors all over the place, and then it's like you need to adjust your content hugging priority, and it's just like
Yeah.
I immediately just got so frustrated because it's like, oh yeah, this was my whole life. I mean, it still is basically as an iOS dev if you're building UIKit stuff. Like this is how this is, right? If you're in this world, and comparing that to a personal app that I've been working on recently, based on some designs that a friend of mine who I'm working with, who's a designer, like he's built the Figma, and then I'm implementing that Figma in code, and we're doing the app in SwiftUI, and I built the entire cell that we need to display all the content we want to display, and it looks exactly like the Figma, and I did it in 15 minutes. I mean, it's once you get good at like Dimitri said, like the H stacks, the V stacks, right, the Z stacks, knowing how to arrange your content and group it together in a hierarchy that makes sense. That part of SwiftUI is amazing, and I think blows the doors off of whether it be storyboard based auto layout constraints, which are they have their pluses and their minuses, or if you're like, no, screw that, I'm not going to do anything in the storyboard, I'm going to do it all in code. The code-based auto layout constraints are, they're different and they have their own pros and cons, but they don't hold a candle to what you can accomplish with some H stacks and some V stacks and some quick modifiers and like, for example, taking a cell and putting a colored stroke around the cell, and the cell itself has rounded corners. Like doing that in UIKit would take forever. And doing it in SwiftUI is 3 lines of code and it's done. And like Dimitri said, you get to see it immediately when the preview works, which is not all the time, but it's getting better. You get to see it immediately as you do it, and your ability to kind of, I would say the downside is that you don't have that visual of the structure as much as you do in a storyboard. So you have to kind of the matrix. You have to like read the view code and visualize it in your head while also, getting to see the finished product in the preview, but going like, well, how did these things fit together? That is something that you can kind of inspect in the storyboard, and you can't really do that very easily because it's all just in code. But in general, I would say for speed and particularly like prototyping, you can't prototype any faster on any Apple platform than you can in SwiftUI. It's stunning how fast you can put something together, and not only does it look halfway decent, it looks production ready. I mean, it's the prototype that you create can be as fancy and as sort of production looking as you want it to be, without really a whole lot of extra work. So in that one regard, I would say that SwiftUI is 1,000 times better than the way that we used to do it with UIKit. And I'm sure we'll get into the downsides. But
when you're running the app, you can actually stop and view the view hierarchy and check out the view hierarchy, right?
Yes, you can.
When you're using the SwiftUI previews, like you don't get the view hierarchy. The view hierarchy is the code.
Yeah. So when you're looking at the preview, right? Like, so what you can do is you can mouse over the preview and you can kind of see
It'll hover
how
over the
things fit
code
together. Yeah. And then vice versa, if you put your cursor on a piece of code, it will like draw a bounding box around the thing. So that's nice, but you don't get the hierarchy that you're talking about. You don't really get. That's what I was saying. Is like you kind of have to sort of have that scaffolding in your brain rather than, like with auto layout in the storyboard, you can click on a view and then you can go look at its list and you can like mouse over them and they show you literally all of the constraints and where they are and all that, right? You don't really get that with SwiftUI. So that is a downside. But and then I would also say the view inspector you're talking about, because what it really is doing is it's grafting all of this onto UIKit components. You end up with like a whole bunch of container views and other things that are like a bunch of intermediary things that you didn't build but that are still there to make it work. So even that is not as useful as that same inspector was in UIKit, just because you're like, what is this 15 layers of stuff that I didn't write, right? You can basically just ignore it, but the downside is it creates a lot more stuff you have to kind of sift through to get to the pieces that matter to you. But I have found, and maybe this is because I'm not creating things complicated enough, but like I have found that I don't actually need to do as much of that kind of like runtime inspection of the view hierarchy with SwiftUI because of that instant feedback that we're getting, right, where you type code and again, if it works, in theory, it's showing you the preview immediately as you type it. It kind of changes the way that you go about designing a view, where you start to think in modularity. You start to think in like, let's build this little tiny thing, and then let's put that on the preview. Okay, now let's wrap that in something that can then move it over here, and then we'll start making room for this other thing. And like you can kind of get into a flow state where you're sort of playing to the strengths of the way that it renders the preview, such that you can kind of build it up over time. And then because of that, it creates, for me anyway, it kind of helps me create a mental model of the structure and the hierarchy, because I'm building it in a modular way. And then I don't really need like the runtime hierarchy inspector as much, right? Because I've already got that mental model.
It's interesting. The more you were talking about this, I think a little bit of the aversion that I feel towards SwiftUI is that auto layout is very easy to explain, but then you said the red lines. It's actually very hard to debug sometimes.
Yes.
Right? Because the theory is so simple. You just need X, Y, width, and height. So if you're doing something wrong, it's a lot of simple steps to get to the right place. It's just frustrating. And SwiftUI, it appears to me that it's the other way around, where explaining it, at least in my mind, is very complex, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of complexity hidden away beneath the views, but using it is very simple, right?
Yeah. And also like with particularly if we're talking with like a storyboard situation, right? You can explain, like, let's say we're trying to explain it to a junior. You can explain how this works, like you said, right? It's very simple to explain. Click the library button, grab a label, drag it in, put it where you want it. Add some constraints to do X, Y, width, and height. You can explain the whole thing in 5 minutes, and then of course it just like chess or whatever. It's like easy to get the rules, and then in a lifetime to
easy
like
to learn,
really
hard to master.
Yeah, get good at it, right?
Yep.
Whereas with SwiftUI, you're presented with you're like, give me a new SwiftUI view, and it gives you a view struct, it gives you the body, and then it's just like blank, 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 and it's just like, okay, well, what do I put here, right?
Yeah.
And they have ways that you can like drag things, but nobody uses that. Like it's
pure code.
It's all in code. And so if you don't know about HStacks and VStacks and texts and images and how all that works, if you don't have that recall, then you're just going to be staring at a cursor, wondering what's possible. And I will say that earlier on in my SwiftUI journey, that was really frustrating because not only because it's not it's not readily there for me to use. I'm like frustrated that I'm basically a junior again. Like, I already went through all this. Why am I starting over? But also like it's just not intuitive. Like there's and like how could it be? I mean, I'm not blaming them. Like I don't think that there's any way that they could have made it just like effortlessly intuitive. But it was really frustrating because it's like I know what I want, but I have no idea how to get there. Whereas I feel like with the storyboard and UIKit, you can just pull up the library and be like, well, I want a table. I don't know, does this work? And you just like grab a table and drag it in, and you're like,
the power
you
of
just like, right? You just mess around. And so whereas what I'm doing a lot with SwiftUI, I mean, even now is like something that I want. I'm like, how does this work? I will just Google it, right? It's all about how good your Google searching is and whether or not you can pinpoint with a Google search the thing you're looking for. And then you like, give me an example. Okay, cool. Let me follow that and modify it. And now it works. And now I can also kind of add that to my toolbox of next time this happens, I'll know what to do. But it's definitely, I think, a higher barrier to entry, I'll say. And I think made worse if you are already a dev and already particularly like a UIKit dev, because you have all this baggage, right? Like
yeah.
If you're a total greenhorn junior, you're just like, tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Right? And I'll just do it. But for us, we're like, oh, but auto layout, like, why can't we, like we have all these like hang-ups about why can't it, is what you said in the first 5 minutes. Why can't it work more like the way I already know how how it works,
yeah.
right? So.
Because I think it's just, at least personally, I think that's part of the my mental block with it. I think SwiftUI is a great technology. It's just that I don't want to feel like a junior again, Ben. It's taken me like more than 10 years to get to this point. And now we're all like, I think that, let me just get on my soapbox and then I'll ask Dimitri a good question about hidden complexity. But it's like everyone's saying like, oh, SwiftUI is going to take over the world. SwiftUI, all the things. And I'm like, no, get away from my job security. And it hurts.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like when Swift launched, right? I mean, I was in the conference room with the company I worked for, and we were watching Dub, and they're like, oh, by the way, we created a brand new programming language. And I'm like, I just got halfway decent at Objective-C. Why are you ruining this for me? So, it ended up being a very long story that it wasn't like you had to switch everything overnight. But yeah, I can totally feel you on that like that feeling of not defeat, but just like that where you feel like you maybe are starting to crest the top of the hill, and then you look up and you're like, oh, there's like 500 more feet of hill now. Like it just.
But it's like somebody put the next mountain in there. Like there was nothing. I could see the sky. I was almost there, and then there's a bigger mountain right in front of me.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just fun. But yeah. Anyway, the interesting part, and I really like hearing about your experiences, is that it feels to me that my mental misunderstanding was also that the internet and Twitter especially, we all know how it polarizes people. Yes. It gets all I heard on my timeline was SwiftUI, all the things, and I was like, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's ever right. Not even with Swift. That's for another. Right. But now that I'm hearing like, no, this is really, really good for like, if we have a view that we need to reuse, I can get that up production ready in 15 minutes. I think that's fantastic. That actually makes me want to learn SwiftUI like right now. Like, okay, what can I reuse from my views and rewrite in SwiftUI? So that's really interesting. Dimi, have you felt like the same way as Ben during your experience working with SwiftUI?
Yeah, so as Ben said, it really is like building up that recall that you need to know what views are available, and more importantly, what view modifiers are available. So the views you can probably count on both hands, the ones that you'll use on a daily basis. It's not very many, honestly. Especially if you're working on like small individual components, you don't even need the iOS 14 or 15 stuff. You can go ahead and use the foundational pieces that came in iOS 13 and macOS 10.15 to go ahead and build something that you can go ahead and use right now and backwards deploy to whatever version your app still runs on. Because that was the biggest sticking point when SwiftUI just came out, is, well, I need to support older versions of the OS and I can't use this. But now that iOS 13 is the base, that's a fairly reasonable starting point now that we have 2-3 years of improvement. If you can build up a repertoire in your head of what views are useful where and how to use them, then you can get up and running very quickly, like Ben said. The biggest setback, though, is learning about all the view modifiers. And that is going to be the hardest part of using SwiftUI well, because there are 3, 4, 5, 6 different ways to separate two views by a certain amount of space. Some of them are better than others, and you're going to get much better code and much better legibility by using some methods over others. But the fact that you can do it in 17 different ways is a good way to get confused quickly, especially if you don't understand how each of those ways manipulates it slightly differently. Like, you can offset a view, you can put padding, you can put a spacer view, you can put spacing in your H stack. Like, there's so many different ways that you can go ahead and manipulate this, and it can really be a gotcha. Like, for instance, a big one is if you put an image as your button label, you'll notice that sometimes the button works and sometimes it doesn't. Can you guess why?
I'm guessing the touch target on the button is like being
It's-
interrupted by the image.
No,
frame
it's
or
the
something?
it's the exact image. So if you click on the black part of the image,
Right,
that will
yeah,
activate the button. If you click on the empty part of the
Yeah,
image,
yeah,
it won't,
right.
because that's
Yeah.
what you said. You said, here's an image. This is my label for the button, and it will do exactly that. So you have to know, okay, we need to put a content, I forget what it's called, a content something
Whatever,
around it to make the button have a bigger presence in terms of like a click area. Another way to do this is you can put a ton of padding around your image, and that will make your button very large, and then you can put negative padding on the outside of your button to actually make it lay out smaller. But that gives you some great benefits. For instance, you have a nice large touch target, but the layout of your button will have the same layout intrinsics of your image. So there are many little tricks like this that you're going to learn as you start using it, and it's impossible to like teach all of them, if that makes any sense. Like, you need to learn them on
Yep.
like while you're running through these different circumstances.
And it's
Well-
so young too that like I don't think anybody has necessarily like come to this is exactly how everyone should do it. Like that, there's a lot of when you look up something, there's a lot of like I did it this way, I did it that way, and like you'll see what Dimitri said. Like you'll see a Stack Overflow set of answers where like it's not just variations on a theme. It's like here's one approach, here's a completely different approach that does the exact same thing. Which is better? I don't know. The votes are about the same. Like you just like you, like basically as a community, I think
They all have
because
30
it's
votes. Which one?
yeah, because it's so new. Like we don't have a collective. This is the best practice for a lot of these things, and I think that can also make it like extra frustrating because you need to learn sort of the first principle of how to do a thing, and then you kind of also want like, okay, this works, but like, is this the right way to do it? And it's not always clear. It's I would say more often than not, it's actually not clear if what you're doing is the right way to do it, like sort of the way that everyone has kind of collectively agreed is like this is the best practice for XYZ reasons.
Yeah, you'll see no one suggests my method of doing the negative padding and the positive padding to like counterbalance
never heard of that.
the button, because like no one is going to think about it. They just want their button to be in a place on the screen. You're not necessarily thinking about, oh, we also want the touch target to be large for touch devices. That way it works really well. And it's only because I ran into the issue where the images would sometimes not tap that I figured, oh, I can put a padding in here. And then I realized, oh, I can control the padding to control the touch target. So it's really all about like figuring out how to like put these pieces together. And that's the missing piece because SwiftUI is so young that there aren't really any best practices, like Ben said. And this gets down to like trying to use SwiftUI in a more complex way as well. So we've talked about how like you can use it as a small component, which I think all of us have done, correct?
Yeah.
So when you want to, like you said, Fernando, you see all these people. Everything needs to be SwiftUI now. Apple allowed you to make an app, and that app struct can go ahead and describe your entire app. There we go. We don't need UIKit. We don't need AppKit anymore. We can just do everything in SwiftUI, and everything will be cross-platform, magical rainbow. And that is unfortunately not like a practical outcome, I think.
I mean, when is it ever when people say multi-platform?
Well, that's how you end up with Electron, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the true multi-platform experience.
Yeah.
I think this is the first time though that a single company has like a really high degree of control over several different platforms. So I can understand at least why Apple would say, well, I can do it right? I can probably make a framework that's cross-platform that works. I don't think they will, but I can at least see that, hey, we got to try this, because everyone that's tried, it's like trying to do it from like trying to merge way different UI and UX from different platforms. And whether we like it or not, the UI and some of the UX for all Apple platforms has been converging. And they swear and promise us that they will never merge the OSs. But even if they don't, they've become more and more similar with time. So it's interesting. I was going to say, someone I follow on Twitter, sorry if I butchered the name, Azam Sharp. He builds courses for iOS and other technologies. I remember a tweet from him from last month. He tweeted, I'll send the link to you, Dimitri. He tweeted, I'm working on SwiftUI recipe course and sharing these small recipes. And at the moment, I was like, that's funky. I don't like, that's interesting, weird. I never put any attention to it. But now that you guys are telling me, like, hey, like the hard part is all of these tiny, code snippets, I would say? UI snippets? Yeah. Those are the missing pieces. And so now it clicked for me that, oh, wow, so that's really interesting. I could see someone like Dimitri and his button padding content insert hack just writing down a bunch of recipes because they work.
Pretty soon we'll just have like a giant like NPM style library collection of hey, literally everything you want to make is here. Just install this package and then pretty soon iOS apps will be nothing but 3,000 Swift PM packages of random UI things, and then like 6 lines of your actual code, and then you're like, all right, done.
Man, I was coming over to Team SwiftUI. Like that just killed me.
Sorry, I ruined it for you.
Honestly, what you described, Fernando, like the recipes, that really reminds me of how I got started learning about web development. So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the way to learn web development was to get these books that kind of went one page, one little recipe of like, this is how you do this one super common thing. And then the next page would be a different collection of these common tasks that you could go ahead and build. And that reminds me of a different site called SwiftUI Lab, which actually goes through a whole bunch of these different scenarios. So if you ever have any questions about like what is SwiftUI doing actually, this is the place that you need to go check, because it will go ahead and outline all the different conditions behind a certain set of behaviors so that we can really get a good understanding of what it's doing. To tie back in with what you're saying about how like Apple doesn't have a cross-platform story, even though they're trying to build one. Something that's interesting is that SwiftUI very much is Apple's cross-platform story. It's not finished. They are making headway like every year to kind of improve it more and more and to get more functionality that's missing from all the platforms within that one framework. But something we have to remember is that SwiftUI actually allows you to do anything, and that means that you can do something wrong. And this is something that AppKit was very good at preventing. So with AppKit, you had a certain set of widgets, and with Interface Builder, you'd be forced to kind of position those widgets in a way that aligned well with the HIG. And you would end up with a UI that always looked like a Mac UI. iOS kind of ruined this, I think, at least for Apple, because every app, instead of having a common set of design paradigms, instead went in the direction of every app is its own unique interface. It has its own unique metrics and button sizing and shapes and behaviors, that a lot of commonalities that Apple tried to build back up with iOS 7 was kind of lost, especially with their no button contour UI design. So we don't have anything like that in UIKit, where you're kind of forced to do something in one way and discouraged from kind of straying from that path. And SwiftUI takes that even further and just makes it really easy to go in any path that you want, which is great for custom user interfaces, which every app will eventually need. But it's very difficult for the parts of the platform that you want to be the same, and it can really mess with that natural progression, like going forward every year, of getting more and more apps that behave the same, and then users are comfortable with them. Instead, we get more and more apps that behave completely differently, and at least they're native, I guess. So that's one benefit.
What does native mean? No, I'm kidding. We can avoid that subject later. But I totally agree with you. It's it's at least something worth thinking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What else would be interesting with SwiftUI? So, like for example, if you like Spencer, have you had any experience with SwiftUI, or are you on the same boat as I am?
I've had a little bit, not near as much as Dimitri and Ben. A couple of us have used it at work recently. In like the latest major update of LumaFusion, there's this this keypad. It's basically like a number pad where like you've got a bunch of sliders to change parameters of like a filter or something, and so instead of just using the slider and kind of having to slide and then hit these nudge buttons, you can put in a specific number, you can do math on it and everything, and that's like the only SwiftUI production code that I have. Other than that, it's just just messing around in very small apps and everything. So getting into the building small-ish components, I definitely agree with Dimitri and Ben on. I think where I have not a ton of experience, and that may be why I feel this way, but as far as getting into the larger apps and dealing with things like navigation, that's where, with my own personal kind of study and experience in SwiftUI, which albeit it's been 6+ months since I've done any of that, that's where I found it really hard, and I felt there was a little bit less control, where the UI itself, like, if we break things down into like nibs basically of SwiftUI, it's awesome. It works really well. But the overall like navigation and kind of moving throughout was hard to get some things to work. You can present things as a sheet and everything, and you've got like your navigation view. But I had a hard time with that, and that's probably just due to my lack of experience with it, I suppose.
I would say yes and no. Like, it
Okay.
probably is. There probably are a few things that maybe you could, that if you had more experience, you would know better sort of what to do in that situation. But I will also say that one of my, for one thing, I really want to hear Dimitri's rant about MVVM with SwiftUI. So we'll get to that hopefully in a minute. But the other thing, so like the big frustration that I have, so we have a production app that just went live in, what's today, the 9th of September? I think like the middle of August, I think is when it went live. And it's an app written, not every line of code is SwiftUI, but it is almost all SwiftUI. There's obviously a bunch of Swift, and then also even some Objective-C in there too. But it is, at least from a UI point of view, I'm trying to think if we have actually any UI kits. I think we have a few small UI kit things, but it is mostly SwiftUI. It's a tab-based application. And then the tabs, in some cases, have nav stacks. In some cases, the views that we show are modal. We also have a multi-page onboarding flow that is all SwiftUI. And so I will say that something that has been very frustrating, and we figured it out, we got it working, but I would pretty much guarantee that the way we're doing it is probably not the best way. And I think a big frustration for me has been, like, again, what is the best practice? And when you Google things and you look on Stack Overflow, again, you get like 6 answers. They're all very different. They all have like the same amount of votes. And you're just like, well, this is better than nothing. Like, I mean, these are ideas that I can try, but I'm not getting any, no one's steering me. I'm not getting any steering towards like consensus. And I think that is largely just because at this point, SwiftUI is, like we said, so new. And like you said, Dimitri, right? If you can do any given thing 17 different ways,
Yeah.
it's just going to take longer, I think, for us to come to consensus around something. Because it's like, well, this is good, and this is good, and this is good. It's like, yeah, those are all ways you can do it. But what are the battle scars for people, and how have they sort of learned the right way to do something? And I think there's so much choice.
Yeah.
It's easier to just have a wider field of options, and also we just haven't been doing it long enough for those battle scars to really hurt yet.
Yeah.
So
I think one thing for me, now that you say that, is one of the hardest things when I was building that numeric view, and I'm sure it would be the same for me with anything in SwiftUI, is reconciling view modifiers, the order in which,
yeah.
because they definitely matter, and that's something that I probably just need to study more. But that was one thing where, you get down to the nitty-gritty details of like it works, but you're like, should I rearrange any of these, or like what is the quote unquote optimal order for a normal view, I suppose. That dealing with all of those view modifiers is just like, wow, okay, this is a lot. Where before it's like you can set the layers, border width and border color in any order you want, and it doesn't matter type of thing. So for me, that was also difficult.
I think that's probably mostly I hope that is like a tooling problem, that it would be really great. It's kind of, again, like it's sort of an open field, right? And so Xcode just like, here's an editor, right? Figure it out. And I think something that would be great is, and this is definitely better than it used to be. Early SwiftUI days, it was just like you would breathe on it wrong, and it would be like, it's broken, and I'm not going to tell you why, but it's broken. It's like, what? So now it's better. They've definitely improved it a bunch. Like the syntax highlighting usually works pretty well.
For sure.
The compiler usually gives you better errors and stuff, but still, some of it is a little bit tea leaf reading, where you're just like, does this go here? I don't know. Let me just try this, and then
exactly. And
clicks
like
into
applying. I remember like trying to apply a border, but it's like you have to apply the border, before the padding or whatever to make it in the actual view you want or whatever. Like if you tried to do it with Dimitri's bounding box thing, it would, or it would actually hit kind of like the view detection box instead of like the inset box and everything. And it's like, oh my gosh, like I know there's logic behind this, but it is really like reading tea leaves sometimes for me.
I'm hopeful that someday maybe we'll get sort of a stop sign fix kind of situation where, like, with regular Swift syntax, sometimes it's like, you did this wrong, but I know how to fix it for you. So let me tell you what you did wrong, and then I'm going to give you a nice button that will just rearrange the order of the arguments, or whatever it is that you need to do to make it right. And obviously that's not going to work in every situation, but I'm hopeful that we're working towards something like that, where in some scenarios it's like, listen, you did this wrong, I know what's wrong, and I actually know how to fix it. Let me show you how to fix it, and then that way, hopefully, because it's a learning experience, right? It really, you can get Xcode to teach you something, and then you're much less likely to do it wrong the second time. Whereas if it just squawks at you and says, this is broken, and I'm not going to tell you why, and I'm not going to tell you how to fix it, even if you come to the right solution eventually through like just sort of playing with it, you may not have been able to pay close enough attention to even realize the exact permutation of what you did to make it right. And then you're like, well, I fixed it, but if this happens again, I'm going to be just as lost as I was this time, right? Whereas if the tooling was a little bit better, again, it's not going to work in every situation, but in the situations where this compiler can figure it out, it'd be nice if it could provide those teaching moments for people, because then they're going to be less likely to do it wrong again.
For sure.
And I think an important part there too is when you look at SwiftUI, especially with modifiers, the modifier is actually containing the views that come before it, the receiver of the modifier in a way. So we're actually looking at it backwards. Like when you used to have a long chain of modifiers and then a dot padding, that just means that everything that came before that dot padding has a padding. So it would perhaps be easier to think about it as we have a padding view, and then you put all that stuff within that padding view. That kind of applies to all of them. There are some cases where you have modifiers that don't return a view, or that are only defined on like text, for instance. So it's a modifier that takes a text and returns a view, or takes a text and returns a text. Those ones are very important to get in the right order, because you can break the chain of having a text at every point in time, and then all of a sudden you no longer have a text, so you can't use that specific modifier.
You want to change the font, and it's no longer text, it's like a view, and it's like, no, views don't have fonts.
But you can take a font modifier and apply it to like an HTAG that has text in it, and it will apply that font to all the text that are in the HTAG.
Right.
That's awesome. That actually brings me up to back to my point about like SwiftUI being easy to implement but hard to understand, because I briefly said this in during a conversation earlier today, but it's like there's a ton of like generics and opaque types and magic that's basically going on behind the scenes, where it's like if you wanted to explain the example I gave in my newsletter earlier was if I wanted to explain a table view to a junior, it would be way easier and the concepts would be way simpler than if I had to explain like a list a list of equal complexity in SwiftUI. Building it would be faster on SwiftUI, but explaining the concept so that you understand, like, no, when you have this, you're changing the view type and then blah, 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 but this function still exists because they wrote it there. Like, all of that is difficult. It's way, way more difficult in SwiftUI. So, yeah, it's interesting for sure.
And
Something that... Go for it.
No. You haven't
Several people are typing.
Okay. Sorry. I was just going to say, and I haven't, as a sort of disclaimer here, I haven't read the whole thing entirely, but Obfuscity.io has a book called, I think it's Understanding SwiftUI or something like that. And I think it's one of the very first chapters. It goes into things like how SwiftUI actually builds that view hierarchy and how it figures out all of those types and everything. And for me, it helped really kind of break down like this arcane magic that is taking all of these random things and combining it into a SwiftUI sum view, this opaque type. But then it gets mad at you when you want to change it. You have some conditional logic in there and it says, no, you can't change this because it doesn't have the same underlying type. It kind of helps, I guess, wrangle that a little bit. But I'm sure there's a lot of knowledge in there. I don't know if anyone else has read it, but I haven't read the whole thing. But it's... So Obfuscity.io always has really good books.
I would say another thing
sure it's great.
is trying to get out of the imperative coding mindset, because like sometimes I'll want to put logic into the view body, and it's like, no, you can't do that. It's like, but if I can't put it in there, like where, I don't know where to put it. Like, if you just get like lost. And so like I needed to do this thing and I don't know where that thing needs to go. And it's not because SwiftUI is like broken. It's because you're implementing,
thinking about it in a
your
different
mental
way.
model is broken. Like, it doesn't work that way. It works differently. You have to totally change. I think that's another thing that I mean, if we're piling on the old man get off my lawn,
I'm not broken, Ben. I am not broken.
No, you're not broken, but you are. But like what I'm saying is that it's not just like a new way to handle auto layout. Right. It's like an entirely different way of thinking about writing code and executing code. It's imperative versus declarative. It's sort of procedural versus like, functional reactive programming style using combine, stuff like that. It's a very different idea. And if you haven't spent a bunch of time in like RX Swift and all these other things that existed before that, then certainly I think one of the first things I did was like that landscapes tutorial that Apple has on their site about SwiftUI. It's an excellent tutorial, and you build something that's really cool. But I did it when SwiftUI first came out, and I was just like, okay, I did that. There is not a chance in hell that I'd be able to replicate what I just did, even by changing a few small things about the app that I wanted to build, and do it myself. Like, it was so, everything about it was just completely different. And that's annoying when, I think it's probably annoying anytime, but like when you have a decade of experience at a particular thing and then a thing comes out that's right next to it, you're like, I got this. Completely lost, and you're like, what is like, it's very demoralizing. So I guess I'm just sort of saying, like, I completely commiserate with your like issues with the whole thing, not even just like where are my auto layout rules, but just how do I build stuff? Like, I was an efficient builder, and now I feel like I'm back to like Lincoln Logs again.
Yeah.
I think something that really helps me conceptualize that particular aspect, which is a big one, is when you're describing your view, you're describing every state your view can ever be in. Yeah. So you need to like take the big brain mentality and really put it to work to really think of all the different gotchas and conditions that you may end up with And what you're left with is a bunch of switches that would turn on and off certain parts of that view. And that's really what's describing like what your app looks like at any given moment in time. And it's easy to if you have an entire app built with SwiftUI, it's easy to kind of look at just one view and be like, okay, in this case, actually it's your entire app that gets laid out every single frame or many times a frame. And it's going to determine, oh, this one little switch from the very beginning of your app or from this other completely unrelated screen, it's going to completely change things. And that is really powerful if you can use it effectively. But it's very confusing if you don't know how the data is moving from like one part of the app to another. And that can get very frustrating. To what you're saying, Ben, about like you need to get out of the imperative mindset, I found it actually easier to use certain parts of like like I want an alert to show up, for instance, is a typical example. In SwiftUI, it kind of pushes you towards, okay, you have your view, you put a dot alert and you declare your alert there, and then you have a switch that would turn on or turn off the alert. And the alert, by the way, will also turn off the alert switch when you dismiss it. Like it's all connected.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if you have something quite complex and there's 4 different errors that could occur in 4 different kind of parts of that screen? Now you have 4 different dot alerts. It turns out before like iOS 14 dot something, that wasn't even possible. It would just concatenate all those alerts into one, and then you just get the last one, which was mind-blowingly annoying. But they fixed that, so that's good. But what I found is super like useful in those situations is to instead have a state object that represents the alert that I want to show, I can imperatively set it to whatever I want whenever an alert shows up, which means my alerts are localized to where the error occurs. They're not just sitting in my view waiting for something to happen. And then whatever I set that alert to, I have a special view modifier that's, I think I called alert presentation. It will just show my data object that represents the alert. So you can think in the imperative mindset, you just have to tweak it so that way it becomes declarative. Like you still have an alert that you know you're going to eventually need to show, and you still have a place where you're going to show that alert. You just don't know what that alert is yet. So you can go ahead and, as a result of something happening, set that alert to whatever you want.
Are we winning you over, Fernando, or is it just even worse now?
I actually have one more question that I think is going to be the decisive question, which is both you, Ben, and Dimitri, you guys have started, like, learned about SwiftUI in apps that were brought from the ground up using SwiftUI, or?
Yes. So the one that I just read about it being released was a greenfield app at the beginning.
So, for example, if I wanted to bring a UIKit app into SwiftUI, I would obviously do it slowly, get a view, move it to SwiftUI, and so on. My question would be, when would I stop? Like
converting, you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. So should I, like, if I already have all my navigation logic, everything, should I just leave that as is? Or after I migrate my views, will I be migrating my navigation? Based on your experiences, like what is my long-term goal moving into SwiftUI?
I would say right now, so this is hopefully the next thing we'll talk about, which is like sort of architecture. I would say right now you're probably better off taking a production, an app that's in production that is entirely UIKit as you sort of migrate the views to SwiftUI. I would say probably do not touch the underlying architecture of the app if it works, if it's working well, until as a community we don't have to, like, I don't think we're probably going to ever end up in a scenario where like MVC is it, right? Like, for example, with UIKit, right? Because MVC ideas were built directly into the SDK, Apple was very clearly signaling that, you can use other things. You can graft Viper on top of this if you really want to. But, like, at the end of the day, you have to deal with MVC, at least in part, because we baked it into the SDK. So then what I decided as a developer was, yes, there's a million other ways we could do this, but why, right? Like the in my opinion, this is going to be a holy word people are going to email us about, but like in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with MVC as an architectural pattern as long as you don't abuse it, right? Just like everything, right?
Agreed.
You can abuse anything and it can be crappy. So, but as long as you avoid things like massive view controller and you do have a good separation of your concerns and stuff like that, and you're just being like a conscientious coder, I don't see any. I've successfully used MVC, dozens of times and never had any issue. Any major issue where like, oh, this architecture is really like ruining my ability to get this accomplished. Like this never happened. So that's kind of, to me, that's the message that we kind of heard from Apple, and that's what we all sort of collectively decided on, barring all people who wanted to do a bunch of other things on the fringes. Don't email me. But with SwiftUI, that isn't, in my opinion, that is not nearly as strongly communicated. A particular path is not being nearly as strongly communicated by Apple in the SDK that they've built for SwiftUI as they did with UIKit and MVC. So I don't think we're probably because of that, I don't think we're probably going to ever end up in a scenario where it's like 99% of the world who builds SwiftUI apps uses MVC, or insert some architecture here. And then like the weird people use something else, right? Like I don't think that's going to happen because we're starting out with a much wider field of possibility, and because there's no strong suggestion from the platform maker, I think a bunch of communities are going to we're going to solidify around probably a few, but it's going to be broader. So I say all of that to say that I probably wouldn't do a bunch of re-architecture of a UIKit to SwiftUI conversion app until, again, if your architecture is working for you, then that's great. If it sucks, then you change it anyway. But if it's working for you, keep it until at least 2 or 3 or 4 camps kind of emerge in the SwiftUI world, where it's like this, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of people are successfully delivering production quality apps of a variety of complexities using this specific implementation and architecture, and it's fantastic and you should use it too, right? Like until that's the case, I probably would just leave that part of the app alone, because the old adage of like, don't basically never,
if it ain't broke.
if it ain't broken, like never rewrite your software. Like it's never a good time to re-architect your entire application, particularly if it's in production. I mean, I think that adage is definitely not always true, but if it's working well, right? Like why?
But isn't MVVM the answer, Ben?
Now you're just goading Dimitri, which I gotta say I'm totally in favor of. That's fine. But
no, I'm genuinely curious. I think what you said was very, very. It made a lot of sense to me. Like just keep going until you reach the architecture and then stop and wait and see.
Yeah.
But I've been hearing like I don't remember who on Twitter was saying like MVVM is just like it's a perfect fit for SwiftUI. And I have to take that at face value because I have no experience with SwiftUI. So I'm more than happy to hear. Yeah.
And I will say, as somebody who's been using it for like a year, I heard early on that, Apple was even kind of lightly signaling that that's what they wanted you to use. It wasn't as heavy-handed as MVC and UIKit, but it was kind of in there. And as somebody who had never seriously used MVVM as an architecture and didn't know anything about FRP, right, like combined sort of RX Swift style programming, hadn't done declarative style stuff before. I mean, I was very much in the MVC imperative, object-oriented protocol programming type of sort of world of building apps, iOS apps. So I was like, okay, sure. Like if that's what they want, I'll just learn that. That's great. Like I was happy to hear that something was kind of the thing that people should use. And then I actually started using SwiftUI, and then I started to learn the declarative style, the combined sort of ideas of publishers and stuff, and kind of changing over from the app delegate to like the app structure and like sort of the whole new way of building apps. And I realized like, oh no, it's not nearly as clear. I don't think that Apple's signaling as strongly as some may have early suggested that they were, that MVVM is the right answer. And then I will also say that I have been on a personal crusade over the last like 3 months trying to, so like for example, in the production app that I manage at work, we actually implemented something called the Swift composable architecture by the Point Free guys into a part of the application. The idea was going to have it be where the entire app was going to be run off the TCA, but we built a piece of it, and then we realized that we didn't know it as well as we thought we did, and so we decided not to let it get into other parts of the app. And it's now basically relegated to one portion, and we've gotten our hands wrapped around it now, and it makes sense now. But I also don't know that it's the choice, the right answer. And for those who don't know, it's sort of I'm going to gloss over most of it, but it's like basically Redux-ish. Like if you're familiar with how Redux works on as a React sort of front end JavaScript kind of architecture, it's similar to that. It takes some of those same ideas. So that was, I think if you had a lot more practice, it might make more sense. But it's really, in my opinion, really obtuse and really hard to learn. And learning everything else on top of that it's just like, it's too much. So then I was like, okay, well, maybe MVVM is the answer. Like just straight, regular, plain, vanilla MVVM. And then maybe, but then it's like, well, but how do you handle navigation and like passing data around? And what if you're involving core data? And like, and Apple's like, oh, just use a property wrapper to connect your core data, fetch request right into your SwiftUI view. And it's like, that doesn't seem right based on everybody that has said that, you should separate your concerns. But then it's like, but if you don't do that, then now you're like rebuilding, you're starting from the first brick of the pyramid to construct a solution. And so sort of bottom line is that I've tried straight MVVM. I've tried MVVM plus like a state machine, a finite state machine designed for the view state. I've tried the TCA. I've tried, I watched some part of a video and then I just couldn't get through the rest of it because I was like, I don't think this is gonna be right. But somebody did a video about taking the Elm architecture ideas from Elm and bringing it to Swift. I was like, this is a lot like what I've already seen, and I don't think it's going to work. And for me, and like, I said, never mind. But basically, bottom line is I've looked at like 6 different, in some ways similar and in other ways very different sort of architectural and organizational styles for building a cohesive SwiftUI app. And I got to say, I'm pretty unimpressed with all of them. And I think the primary reason for that is because, I'm pretty new to this kind of programming, and SwiftUI and stuff. And then, and so I don't have a bunch of, like my sniff test isn't very good yet, right? Like I don't, I just like, this sounds good. And I just try it and it's like, oh, it has all these problems. And then the second thing is, and this is my gripe as an educator, is that like, there are very few resources that I found where the approach that they describe is then shown to you with a non-trivial example.
Right.
And you're like, we've
been hearing that since Lambda.
This is great when it's like 3 views and they're all just displaying text and there's nothing coming from the internet and there's no core data and there's no, like, this is fantastic when that's the situation. But as soon as you involve anything more complicated than that, I'm sure you can do it, but like, that's the whole point. I'm trying to learn how this technique or this approach or this architecture works in a variety of scenarios, and I hit a wall where I'm like, I want to add core data to this. Okay, well, where does that go, and how does that work?
God,
how does that
core data
fit in, right? And like, it just doesn't. I'm sure it's doable. It's just that like, I personally have not found a winning sort of set of steps to get me there. So rant over, but it's been bugging me for months. I'm just like, why is this so hard? And
We become the web.
yeah, yes. The things that one thing we've all dreaded forever. It's finally happened. So Dimitri, save me
Yes.
from all of this craziness. If you can.
Let me solve all your problems. Fernando, to answer your question that you had before, don't rewrite any part of your app in SwiftUI. Anytime you have a view that is going to change drastically in design,
There you go.
use that as an opportunity to rewrite that part. And then work piecemeal just what you need to change. Like if you have an old crusty piece of view that you never gets touched for 10 years, but it works, keep it. There's no need to pull that out. The nice thing
But
about
where's the
SwiftUI,
fun in that, Dimitri?
the lack of chaos. The nice thing about SwiftUI is every time you need to use SwiftUI, you get a UI view controller, a UI hosting controller, it's called, and you can just put it wherever you want. Anytime you need to use UIKit in SwiftUI, you have a UI view controller representable, and you can fit it in right wherever you want it. In the end, it's still a UIKit app that is just laid out by SwiftUI. So that's something that is that I want to bring up. It's really easy to mix and match these pieces and to take it very piecemeal, just where you need it. So you don't need to go all gung ho all in until you want to rewrite everything from scratch. Or I guess you get to 80% of the way there, and then there's just a few screens left. Because you'll find when you rewrite a screen in SwiftUI, it's going to be really quick to get the layout looking just the way you want it. But the data model is going to be a little bit more complicated, and that's where you'll need a lot of practice to kind of get it just right. So the reason why I think SwiftUI does not fit with any existing paradigm in terms of how to structure an app, and Spencer and I on episode 43, I think, talked about different ways of different reasons why a team would use one architecture over another. So I invite anyone who's listening to this episode to go and listen to that one as well, because there's a lot of commonalities as far as why you would want to use one over the other. But the thing that's different about SwiftUI is the view that you're writing is not really a quote-unquote view in the same way that a UIKit view was. You're describing what your view hierarchy is going to look like. You're not really describing what one view is.
I like that.
And that really turns your view itself into a model, which immediately puts a wrench in everyone's ideas of what is the view, what's the model, what's the controller. There's no controller. Right. That's to be seen. In fact, the property wrappers, for core data, that can probably be a controller if you want to really contrive your words. But you have everything that is a struct, and all your views are just describing a tree. So that's one thing. All your data is persisted via these property wrappers, and they need to be because you need to have references for an app to work. Object-oriented programming works because it is so it works so well with how we think about the world around us. And if you don't have references to kind of tie everything together, programming becomes really hard again, as it was back before object-oriented programming. So that's why we have all these property wrappers, which work in different ways to hold on to data, to create new references to data, and to link different views up together. Now, one downside of these property wrappers is anything that's not the view does not get access to them. So, for instance, if you have some controller logic that's in its own class, it does not have access to any of the environments that the view has, even though it is a property on that view. So that's something that you really need to realize early on as you start architecting your app, that some architectures might work well for and others might not. Moving on to MVVM. It really depends on what you consider to be the model, the view, and the view model in this story. As I said, the view that we're working with in SwiftUI, technically it's a model, you're describing data. It's not really describing what the view looks like.
Agreed.
100%. There's a whole lot of functionality that's as a part of that view that contains the data and stuff. In fact, it looks a lot like a view controller when you take a few steps back.
I was going to say,
it has the state of the data that you're talking about. You pass that state in when you create that object, or that piece of data. I don't know. Are structs objects? I always call them objects because it's easier to just get the conversation
Just
moving
for
along.
purposes of argument, let's say yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
An enum is an object, a struct is an object, a class instantiation is an object. They're all objects.
So your SwiftUI view that you create, it has data, it has the view hierarchy that you're creating, and it has functionality as well. So if you have any buttons, those are going to invoke something and do something that's going to change the behavior of your app. So all of that is contained within that view. And that is a recipe for like massive view controllers. Like you can end up in that same exact situation if you don't really know what you're doing, which is why we really want there to be some pattern that we can follow. But none of the patterns were really invented for SwiftUI. They were all invented for trying to evolve upon MVC. And I think they are trying to do that because there's some other goal in place. Like for the composable architecture, you want to be able to have everything be truly independent of one another so you can hot swap things at a given moment. Most apps don't need to do this.
Right.
Like for all intents and purposes, you don't need to hot swap your views on a given moment unless you have a team of 500 people that are all working on different parts and you want to be able to like experiment and see different things as they work. So if you don't need that functionality, there's no point going in that direction, adding all that complexity, because you're just going to balloon the mental map that you need to have of your project. And that oftentimes, if you're a small team, just makes it super complicated. In MVVM's case, SwiftUI seemed like it was using that because you'd have your view, you'd have a state object, and you'd have a view model. Now, if that view model is just a model, it's not doing any business logic, it just has some data that it's holding onto, then that works great. You have a model, view, and a view model. And your view model is kind of transforming your model into something that the view is going to be happy with. As soon as you add functionality to that view model, that's when it gets really complicated, because now all of a sudden that view model, it would be really nice for it to know what the environment that the view was working with was, or what those initial arguments that were passed in were. But you can't actually pass it to that view model because those, like, they're not created at the same time. That state object thing is very special, and it's not actually created when your view is created. It's created a step later, right before the body is actually run. So unless you actually realize how SwiftUI is put together, like, that is going to take a long time for you to like piecemeal together and get that working in a way that you want. Specifically, what was really hard for us is we were passing around our network session, which was a class that did all of our network operations as an environment, which was really clean to do, because at the beginning of the app, you can say, here's the network session that the app is going to use. In all the previews, we can have a preview network session. In testing, we can have a different network session. It's really easy to inject at any point in time. And it would be transparent to all the views. All we would need to do is document a little bit that says, hey, if you don't pass a network session at one point, this view is going to crash when you load it up because it's expecting it. That's all that was required of that. But a view model that was in charge of like actually loading the data from the network and then setting some properties so that way the view can react to that, it was not able to get access to that network session because it was part of two different trees. You have the view with your environment in there, and then the view has a property for the view model that is a separate object. And it's going to be one that's going to be persisted no matter how many times the view is recreated. So the only way to fix that, if we wanted to keep using a view model, is to have a property called view on the view model, and in onAppear on our view to assign the view, so that way the view model knows what the view is, so that way it can fetch the environment from the view because it's just a property on the view. So there are ways to make this work, but it gets really
that sounds
squirrely.
messy.
Yeah.
And it makes you start to think, why do we have a view model to begin with? Like, we're just separating the code for one controller into two files. Like, that's ultimately what it did. You have one file with some business logic and some model, and then you have another file with the view with some model and just layout, basically. So combining these is pretty easy. You can just put stuff in an extension, and then it's one logical thing from the compiler's point of view, and all the properties are now visible to all the other properties, which is really clean, not clean architecture, but just clean in terms of like thinking about what the view is doing. So that was kind of the start of when I decided, like, in our app that we were building, we're just going to start getting rid of these view models because it adds an extra thing that we need to go check when we need to look for functionality. Our view is tightly coupled to it. It is constantly calling in that view model to perform actions, to load data.
So what are you gaining, right? If it's tightly coupled anyway, then what are you gaining by doing it?
Exactly. And the only circumstance where we are using a view model is if there is a substantial amount of functionality that the business logic needs to do for that screen, but we want to have multiple views for it. So the great thing about nibs, for instance, is you can have several nibs for one controller. So that one controller can look very different in different circumstances, and you can do the same thing in SwiftUI if you use a view model, for instance. So that view model or coordinator or whatever you want to call it that has all the business logic, it can just have a bunch of properties that your view, whatever custom view you want, can just go ahead and reconfigure its internal hierarchy, but still have the same data that's working in the same way. That's a very useful use of a view model. And in fact, SwiftUI kind of uses this with styles. So anytime you have buttons or switches or things like that, you can configure as a property a style, and that will go ahead and relay out the view in wildly different ways. But if you pay attention to that, the view that you're using, that's your view model, and you're attaching a style to it, which is configuring the view in a different way. So it's a very backwards way of thinking about it that is very SwiftUI specific. So Apple's kind of inventing a new way of architecting apps, and I don't think that they have a complete story yet in terms of like how you should go ahead and do it. But I want to discourage people from sticking to one architecture or another because none of them are going to fit. They've all been invented with other goals in mind, and SwiftUI is a very different beast, and you really need to keep it simple for yourself to be able to manage it. So the less you kind of marry yourself to one type of architecture or another, and the more you just try to write code that is easily understandable and consistent within the scope of that application, the more you're going to benefit. So to that end, here are some pointers that I want to encourage everyone to kind of think about when you are building out your screens in SwiftUI. So we talked about components. This is when you're really building out an entire screen, and you're really writing a replacement for a view controller at this point. So you have your custom view. You will have your state at the top, so all your properties, all your bindings that you might need. You'll have your body. I want to encourage you, don't have a crazy hierarchy of HStacks and navigation. Like don't have any of that within your body. Try to have properties that represent different parts of that hierarchy and call those properties. So that your body ends up, instead of being 300 lines long of code, it ends up being 7 properties, one after another, that clearly describe this is the header, this is the profile section, this is your this is your that, and all of that is in a scroll view. That's your entire body. And then later down in the file or in a separate file, you have an extension that will go ahead and declare those properties as subviews. Like that's what they are. So your main controller view, it just has pointers to subviews that are more well contained, whether they're properties, whether they're like entire views that are reusable between the app. Like if you don't need to reuse it, don't make it into its custom view with its own state. Like let it share the state with the rest of the thing.
Right. Agreed.
Simplify your process, right? You don't need to have a rigid pattern for everything, especially if you just use something once. If you use something once, just type it once. That's it. Don't type it in a way that you need to reuse it everywhere. And then finally,
I've done that, and it's really, I can +1. It's very handy, not just because it helps you describe it, but also because often you'll have stuff around that main sort of list of things, right? So stuff like navigation titles and on appears and stuff like that. And if you do it the way that Dimitri described, you can look at the body and you can really get a good sense of what that screen is doing in its entirety without having to scroll 3 pages worth of stuff because you put all your HTAGs and everything in one spot. And then by the time you get to the bottom, you're like, wait, what was the thing at the top again? Like you know, it gets so long that it's literally too much to keep in your head at once. So having it be, I've started doing that, and it was like, holy crap, why didn't I do this the whole time? This is so much better. It's like so
because
much
it's complicated. The first
better.
time you try to do that, you're like, okay,
Yeah.
what does this property return? And you're like,
Yes.
some view. And then you try to put an if statement, and it's like, it's very mad at you. So you're like, do I use any view here? And then, like, you have Dimitri in the background saying, no, never use any view. Like, all you really need to do is add @ViewBuilder. That's it.
Yeah.
Like,
View Builder is
add
awesome.
@ViewBuilder to everything, and then it just turns into a SwiftUI body, basically. So once you have your sections, you have your data, you have your body, you have your subviews, wherever you want to put them in a different file, in the same file, who cares? Like, computers have infinite memory nowadays for text. Like, in all intents and purposes, you can have a giant file, as long as it's well organized, it's easy to get to. Like, you have everything categorized, it's fine. The last section that you want is going to be your methods. So all the actions that your buttons can take, that your onAppear might invoke, make a function, an action for each of those that doesn't take any properties, or any arguments, I should say. And what's really neat is anytime you have a button, you can type a button, open parentheses, action, colon, do the thing, no parentheses, close your parentheses, open curly brace, you have your label for your button. And you are just referring to selectors at that point, just like you're used to in UIKit. onAppear calls a different function, but it doesn't call it as a block. It just passes the function as reference, and it will go ahead and know how to call that. It actually passes self in and does all of that stuff for you, so you have really clean looking code that's easy to read, and that's the most important thing, I think. So that's kind of the architecture, if you can call it that, that I've settled on, which is to say, don't follow any rigid architecture. It's still kind of MVC if you think about it as like, this is your view controller. You can call it MVS if you want, because it's a model view screen. This is your screen view. It does a little more than your regular smaller views. That's about it. And I think that that has been working really well for us in our app, especially as we've been restructuring it and cleaning up a lot of the experiments, just like Ben did. We experimented in 300 different ways to try to see what really works well. And in the end, that is something that works really well. And then finally, you have your previews at the very bottom. And if you've done everything well, you don't need to pass any arguments to your view. You don't need to pass any mocking stuff. You can just use your view, and you can go ahead and see it in 3 different scenarios: white mode, dark mode, gigantic, accessibility text, and it's very isolated at that point. And if you build this correctly, you don't want to have navigation view in any of your screens. You want that at the highest level of your scene, that kind of just describes the general structure of your app. But your individual views, you don't want them to deal with navigation views. You want them to be individual screens, and they will push something on the navigation stack. Maybe you can even allow them to call closure to decide what to push. Then you don't have to have that view decide. It can just pass the data, and then whatever's calling it can go ahead and use that data to make a new view. And then what you end up with is, at your scene, you end up with a storyboard that goes and describes, here are your tabs. Your tab has a navigation. Your navigation calls this screen, and then this screen, and then this screen. So you have 3 levels, and you see them all right there. Nothing is tightly coupled, and it's fairly easy to see. And you get the benefits of the storyboard without the downsides of having a storyboard file, because you can still visually see it, just in code, and hopefully with just a few lines of code, if you did that process right. Now, it requires planning. It requires some forethought into how you're going to be doing this, but it can be cleaned up over time. And the super nice thing about SwiftUI is it's really easy to iterate, and to kind of make these changes as you need them. A final thing I wanted to say is, Ben brought up state something. Oh no.
Machine.
State machine. Yep. So if you have a complex view and it might seem impossible to build in SwiftUI, one thing that we built was a barcode scanner. So basically, you have your phone. It has a little barcode scanning thing at the top. You scan an object and you try to fulfill basically someone's grocery orders. Like you get 3 apples, you get 2 boxes of Oreos, 3 cans of Coke, yada, yada, yada. There was a lot of UI involved in this because apples you need to weigh. The Coke comes in packs or whatever. Different things you need to count. Some things you need to enter the price because it's cut like by weight, like at the deli. So there's a ton of different UI here, and different things required a different sequence of events. What we basically did is we have a giant enum that describes all of these different situations, and the enum is actually pretty simple. It has like you start, you're in the process of scanning, and then it's done. But the process of scanning is a different enum that has 3 different scenarios for the different kinds of things that can be scanned. So we split it up into all of these different things, and then our view ended up just being a switch statement that calls into different configurations of our UI that we wanted. And this turns out to be really easy to conceptualize. It's really easy to add to. If you have a new thing that you need to scan, you add it to the enum. Swift complains everywhere about, hey, you forgot this case, you forgot this case, you forgot this case. And you don't forget one. Like you are sure to get every single one of those, and you don't mess up as a result. So state machines with SwiftUI is like so nice to work with, because it just takes care of all the rough edges. You just need to think about the scenarios that you want, and you might need to do a little work to get the animations working the way you want, but once you get it to work, it's not complicated hacky code. It just, you found the ideal in a way, and I was really pleased with that.
I will add one, like a +1 to Dimitri's comment. Like when I became team lead for one of the VPN companies I worked for, we were having a ton of issues with like the VPN changing states, toggling the UI, like where it's connecting, disconnecting, connected, and state machines using Swift's enums. It just solved everything. Like you just describe every state and let the compiler help you out, and it's just so powerful. So yes, I think that's going to be at least if I start migrating anything to SwiftUI, definitely enums are my best friend. I don't know if you remember everyone, but especially Ben. I actually gave my Lambda
you did
talk on enums because enums are cool.
And he was like, I'm going to do a talk on enums and how they're cool. I was like, all right, well, good luck with that. but I got to say, obviously it was an excellent talk because I hired you. So
Yep.
No, but it was really good.
Yeah, I happily use switch statements with like even optionals, .sum, .none. And a superpower of switch statements is you can combine different enums in one. So you can say switch, open parenthesis, my enum A and comma, my enum B, close parentheses, and then you can switch on both of these in every case. So you can go ahead and make sure that you hit every permutation because the compiler is going to yell at you if you miss one. So if you don't care, you can put an underscore for one of the cases, but it still works, and it's really, really nice to use.
You can switch on a result type too, which is fun.
Also an enum.
Yeah.
Right.
Whew. That was a lot, but you convinced me. Honestly,
Yeah.
I am probably going to go very slowly and methodically, just working my way through a bunch of views and just going into SwiftUI, and then I'll ping you every time I hit a wall.
Well, like Dimitri said, you can kind of add it at your leisure, where that's what I and a coworker did, like with that numeric view. The rest of the app uses UIKit, but we were just like, yeah, it'd be kind of fun to, do SwiftUI. My boss was like, yeah, go for it. And we did it. And it's, there's a little bit of back and forth trying to get it to interact with UIKit, but it's not that bad. And it's self-contained, and you can do it for as many views as you want to or don't want to. It's kind of nice.
This week's episode of Code Completion is brought to you by Weekly Swift Exercises. Learning Swift, there's no substitute for practicing. There's dozens, literally dozens of people Fernando's mentored through different programs, and he's seen it time and time again. After you learn the basics of programming, you slow down because learning through experience is demanding and painful. Increasing your confidence is key, and there's an easy way to do it: practice. Fernando's weekly exercises help you practice concepts like closures and protocols while implementing actual features like dark mode. It's free to join. Besides the exercises, Fernando sends 1 or 2 articles about learning Swift. Some are technical in nature, but most of them will help you in your career by teaching things like best practices, working as a team, and getting ready to get your first job. Thanks again to Fernando and Weekly Swift Exercises for sponsoring Code Completion. Go to twitter.com/SwiftExercises, that's SwiftExercises, today to learn more. Now that we've gone through our topics, it's time for Complete the Code, where we quiz our listeners on your knowledge of Swift, Apple, and all things development. Spencer?
Yep. So last week we had a SwiftUI question for you all, and it is, why is the SwiftUI code not advisable, and how can you fix it? So we have a winner, Pitt, who writes, because you create 2 branches and that brings problems like broken animation. A better solution is to use a ternary conditional to display a different string. So for example, he says, having a text with a Boolean for is logged in, question mark, a string of you are logged in, colon, you must first log in as a string as well. And that's absolutely correct. Now, sometimes you might want to branch, especially if you want to represent 2 different views animating in and out, but that's often an exception, so this is a good pattern to look out for. This week we have a concurrency question for you. So if you're listening to the podcast, you can check the podcast art or the show notes to follow along. Since Swift's async await syntax is making its way to Xcode 13, how would you transform the code below, which schedules a network call, lets us know the request was sent, and then prints when the response was received, to use the new async await pattern?
So can you complete the code? Tweet your answers to us with hashtag CompleteTheCode, all one word. The first to get it right will get a shout out on a future episode. And with all that out of the way, it's time for Compiler Error, a segment where I get to test my fellow completionists' knowledge about Swift, Apple, and all things development. And today we have a theme, and that is SwiftUI view modifiers.
Awesome.
Great.
Okay, so we have 4 statements for all of you about SwiftUI view modifiers. Let's take them one by one. So number 1, much like UIKit, SwiftUI allows the interface orientation to be manipulated using status bar orientation, moving the status bar to one of the 4 screen edges. Statement number 2, tooltips can be added to SwiftUI views using the help modifier, helping to guide the user around the interface without them needing to directly invoke any actions. Statement number 3, any view in the hierarchy can be modified with onOpenURL perform to perform localized URL handling so long as it is part of the hierarchy when the URL is opened. And statement number 4, a badge can be added to tab bar items using the badge modifier, but this will also add a visual indicator to list rows to help convey supplementary information. So Spencer, why don't you go first?
Awesome. All of these sound... I have no idea. The first one, the orientation, something like that sounds familiar, especially for the previews, so that you can preview things in the right orientation. I don't know if it's on the status bar, though. There are like built-in tooltips with SwiftUI as far as I remember, but I don't know if it's on the help modifier, so none of this really does me any good. As long as it's a part of the hierarchy when it's open. Interesting. Yeah, I have no clue on any of these. I think I'll go with number 3 because I have not seen that at all, but that could also just be due to my limited experience.
An excellent choice. Ben?
So you'd think I'd be good at this with probably the second most experience of this group. But as usual, Dimitri has managed to like find things that are not necessarily in my wheelhouse. So I'm pretty sure that number 3 is correct. I think that may even have been a relatively recent change, but I think number 3 is correct. Sorry, Spencer. Of course, I could also be wrong with that.
That's all good.
The badge modifier sounds right. Whether it can also be used as a visual indicator on list rows for supplementary information, I'm less confident of, but I'm just going to say that because I think the first part is right, I'm going to assume the second part is right, which is probably not a good strategy, but whatever. So then it leaves us with 1 and 2. 1 seems wrong, like that you would be able to manipulate the orientation using a status bar method, but again, SwiftUI is weird. Maybe they changed something. Maybe they just approach it differently. I'm going to go with number 1, and I feel 50% confident about it. So, there we are.
An excellent choice. And Fernando? I was nice and let you go last since you
Thank you. I actually noticed, and yeah, I appreciate it. Not that it would have helped. I was hoping for it to help, but Ben kind of let me down there.
Sorry.
He did say that the status bar thing is kind of weird, but UIKit is kind of weird. So I'm gonna say that if I were to redo like a UI framework or build one from scratch, I wouldn't do status bar orientation to change the orientation. But since it's UIKit all the way down, I'm honestly the one that I think is fake is number 2. Tooltips can be added to SwiftUI views using the help modifier, helping guide the user. I don't know what guide the user means. If guide the user means like next accessibility view, I could believe it. I'm gonna go with number 2. Yeah, number 2. Apple doesn't like accessibility, so.
What?
A dubious statement and an excellent choice nonetheless. So let's take these in reverse order, since you all agree with number 4 that a badge can be added to a tab bar item using the badge modifier. And I'm surprised you all believe this to be true, because in my app I needed to write a custom badge just to put like a number on a shopping cart. And that's because this is new as of iOS 15. So good job believing this. And the badge is only usable for tab bar items and for list rows. And this is mostly for macOS, where on source lists, on the right side of the source list, you often have like a number to indicate like how many unread emails and stuff like that. Gotcha. So this is absolutely true. So
it's barely true, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like as of next week, it'll be
true.
Yeah.
So that brings us to number 3. And I can say, sorry, Spencer, this is absolutely true as well. And it's pretty cool that you don't have to have... it does feel very wrong. Typing it the first time, I was like, where do I put this on OpenURL? Just anywhere?
Yeah.
I guess anywhere works. And it seems like it will do the right thing, where if you have multiple of them, it will call all of them, which is pretty neat. So you can go ahead and handle URLs a little bit more succinctly, so long as your view is in the hierarchy, right? If your view is on the hierarchy, on OpenURL never gets called, and therefore the system doesn't know it exists. So that's something that you need to look out for. So sorry, Spencer.
So again, we've become the web. I'm kidding.
So moving on to number 2. So Fernando, you have serious qualms about me adding flavor text to kind of flesh out what these view modifiers are, and you had a problem with the word guide in terms of guiding the user around, which I felt was a good way of describing what tooltips do.
He sounds really offended. I don't know what you've done, Fernando.
Well, that's not. Well, I guess tooltips don't guide the user, right? They're just like additional info, like
they
subtitles.
They inform the user, right?
Inform is not guiding.
This just turned into an English class.
Yes, exactly.
Well,
can I use my English as a second language card, or
no?
In any case, iOS does not have tooltips, so that means that you are absolutely incorrect, Fernando, because
Wait,
it is
what?
still a view modifier that is declared on all SDKs. So
No.
yeah, it's primarily meant for tooltips on the Mac, and they exist on iOS, but you don't have tooltips on iOS, so I guess it doesn't complain if you type it. That's the benefit. And all that means that good job, Ben. Number one is incorrect.
For once.
For once.
Good job.
I'm glad I tricked you, Fernando, because I think you remembered that status bar orientation, that the orientation of the device is set according to the status bar orientation.
It used to be, yes.
In UIKit. And I was looking up how to do like status bar stuff because I haven't done it since like iOS 6. And it's like very different now, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I was looking for this method. I don't even think this method is declared anymore. I think it's like long since deprecated to do it in UIKit. But it absolutely does not exist in SwiftUI. So you have no chance to rotate the UI in SwiftUI like intentionally, which is a shame because setting the status bar actually changed the input transformation. So if you don't know, when you tap on something with your finger, you think you're tapping a part of the screen, but your finger is actually touching a different part of the screen. So the OS will actually adjust for that and shift your finger so that way it's actually touching what you think you're touching. And that is based on the status bar placement. So if the status bar is on the side, you'll notice that as you tap stuff, it's tapping to the left or to the right of where your finger is. And you can often like play around with this if you put your phone flat on a table and spin it around upside down and you try to tap stuff. It's very hard. Like all of a sudden you're not tapping the things that you think you're tapping. You're tapping like too high or too low. So it's a bit disappointing that doesn't exist on SwiftUI if you need to do anything custom, but it doesn't. So good job, Ben. And good luck to Spencer and Fernando in the next one, I guess.
Did I just get bamboozled twice in a single code? Like this is wrong in so many levels.
You should have trusted Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. You're right.
Which, to be fair to you, Fernando, is good advice only like half the time. And that's probably pretty generous. So.
50% of the time,
Works
it
every
works
time.
every
It works
time.
every time.
Exactly.
Well, you did cover the other 50%, so not a bad strategy.
Yeah.
So as always, I want to personally thank everyone for listening in this week. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at CodeCompletion to know when new episodes get released, and feel free to tweet at us if there's ever a topic you'd like for us to dig into. Most importantly, as a small podcast, please be sure to share this with your friends and family who are also interested in any part of the process of app development. It's your support that enables us to continue doing this, and we hope to grow a healthy community around everything we discuss. Once again, I want to give my thanks to Spencer, who is at Spencer C. Curtis, that's SpencerCurtis on Twitter, Fernando, who is at From Junior to Senior, that's FROMJRTOSR on Twitter, and Ben, who is at Ferris Guy, that's FERROUSGY on Twitter, for joining me this week. My name once again is Dimitri. You can find me at Dimitri Buñol, that's DIMITRIBOUNIOL, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
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 So as a sort of a mini after show, what kind of announcements do you think we're going to get next week as this episode airs hours before the keynote?
Well, John Prosser is already showing off 3D renders of the iPhone 14, so I don't think we even care about what they're going to do on Tuesday. I mean, come on.
We don't need
There's an
those
event
13s.
We're getting a
I'm
punch
kidding.
hole camera. We're getting flush camera lenses in the back. We're getting, I think, underscreen Touch ID supposedly on the iPhone.
But does
14.
it
Flush
come in
camera
mini?
lenses. What is
Yeah.
this, 2014?
Well, his prognostication is that they're taking the iPhone 4 architecture and redoing it for these size phones. So like titanium rails, flush glass, the hole punch camera on the front.
It's an actual hole punch. There's a hole just straight
Yeah,
through.
there's a hole all the way through the hole. Yeah.
I will never get used to the tri-camera setup. It's just so ugly. So ugly. Like, I understand,
Well-
I like it in the functional sense, but it's just so ugly.
I have
I
the
think they
two
need to
camera
add more.
setup,
Yeah.
and
They
I
need
was
to add
like,
more
I don't need the
lenses.
zoom. And then I've been kind of like, I wish I had a zoom lens.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree 100%.
I grab Lynn's camera all the time just to have zoom because hers is the big one. But she
you have
hates
a
that it's the
mini
big
and a
one.
max, right? Isn't that what you got?
No, not a max. Just
Oh,
the
just
regular one. I call the big one because it's ginormous compared to the little one. It's like an aircraft carrier.
Do you think we're getting an iPhone 13 mini?
I think
was gonna
so.
say-
I don't think we're going to get a 14 mini. I think that was out, and I am deeply saddened by that rumor. I'm already like prepared for the worst of needing to reacclimate to a giant phone.
After only a year, I'm at 88% maximum capacity on my battery. So I got to say, my battery on the 12 has seemingly not kept up or like held up as well as previous phones. I don't know about you guys, but
I'm going to
Yeah,
check right now.
mine is pretty bad.
I would be extremely surprised if we got a mini.
89.
I'm bracing for
89.
impact because 89%.
you have a mini, right? 89.
Yeah, I do. Even then, I don't feel as bad because we just bought like 10 HomePod minis and they're all over the place, and they're draining my battery like it just melts away. So I am thinking of getting like a regular 14.
Because you're streaming or because why?
Yeah, we do a lot of fair play streaming.
Okay.
So
I got the little battery pack thing, and I've been fairly happy with that to like get through the day.
Yeah.
Because the mini, it is tough to get through the day with it.
what
Yeah.
battery pack? Because I could
the
use
MagSafe
one.
The MagSafe
Oh.
one. So I usually use it as like a wireless charger. Like it's just in the couch.
The
plugged
Apple
in,
one
and
or the Anchor one?
Yeah, the Apple one.
Apple. Okay.
So like you can either charge the battery pack to the phone or the phone to the battery pack. Like it works in all directions. So what I have it set up as is like a wireless charger in the couch. So I just kind of like clink the phone onto there. But then anytime I go out, I just grab it and the battery pack.
That is so cool. I'm definitely getting one of these. Yep.
Yeah, it's not getting you a ton of extra capacity, like by any means, but it is enough to hold over the mini like for a good 24 hours. Whereas before, I feel like towards the end of the day, it's kind of dead.
Yeah, it's happened to me. It actually happened to me this week where I was at like 20% at like 4 p.m. And I'm like, oh my God. The good news is that I have a like 20 watt charger or 30 watt. I don't remember which one. So it's like 30 minutes and I'll be up like
Yeah, like
40,
Right.
50%.
entirely charged.
Yeah, but still, the wireless, this is really cool. I'm definitely getting one.
If you don't care about it being Apple, Ben mentioned the Anchor one, and it's like $50 instead of $100.
Does it charge
Definitely.
in both directions?
I like that.
I don't think
I don't
so.
know.
So
It also
that's-
doesn't have the fancy integration of like, it doesn't show up in the widget and it doesn't like
Right.
all that stuff.
Yeah, so the charging in both directions is something that's really cool.
That is cool.
What do you mean charger in two directions?
So if the battery is plugged in to the charger and you put your phone on the battery will charge your phone. If there's nothing plugged in, the battery will charge your phone. If the phone is plugged in, the phone will charge the battery.
Neat. That's neat.
Yeah, that is cool.
So what do we think about the watch, about the 7th gen watch? I've heard flat sides like the
edges,
12. Right? I've heard bigger screen. I've heard 41 and 45 millimeter, and people are now like, does that mean that we're going to have to get different bands? Like my mom literally she buys like the cheap ones on Amazon that look just like the real ones and basically are just like the real ones. She has probably 40 watch bands at this point that she's collected over the last, several years. So if suddenly she's not going to probably get a new watch immediately, but like that's probably a thing, right? People probably have decent sized collections at this point of watch bands. And if they go, sorry, you got to redo all of that, that's going to be a problem.
Apple has been
Welcome
pretty
to
good
Apple.
about bands,
Yeah, they have.
right?
Dimitri?
I can foresee them being like if they do change it, then they give you an adapter or something so that you can still use all of your bands or something like that.
Yeah.
I
Especially
think
because
it'll probably still fit. It just won't be like flush, if
Right.
that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
because they've got like the hardcore leather like Hermes bands that are hundreds of dollars,
Yeah.
like more expensive than the watch. It's not like
Right.
I don't know, maybe
Or
They're
those
like, oh,
yeah,
we
those,
can get.
those are Mez ones. Are you talking about right? Those are like crazy
Yeah.
expensive.
Yeah.
I really wanted one, but I can't justify how expensive they are.
Just get
Yeah.
a Mac Pro instead.
I was just gonna say, you spend that money on a Mac Pro.
And every time I go to get a new watch, I'm like, should I get like the stainless steel one, or like I really wanted a ceramic one. They were so cool looking.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
I wanted the
but-
ceramic one
yeah,
so
I was
bad.
just like, I can't. Like, it's like
Why?
so expensive, and then
Yeah.
it's literally exactly the same thing on the inside. And then next year, when the new one comes out, I'm like, I'm gonna want it, and I will
Yeah.
have just spent all of this money for nothing. Like, I mean, not literally for nothing, but
I
like,
hear you.
I just every time I'm like, ooh, and then I just go and I buy a sport. I just buy like the regular
If-
aluminum one.
If they do come out with like a ceramic or something fancy, I may ask Sylvia to get it to me as like a Christmas present.
Like a gift, yeah.
Yeah, that way I could. Yeah.
Isn't the
Let-
hotness right now is titanium, right? Is it the Series 6? I think that the high end
Think
metal
so.
is titanium.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the ceramic tends to skip generations, which
Right.
like Lynn is really mad at because she always wants one, and whenever it's her turn to update watches, there's no ceramic one. And whenever it's my turn to update watches, there's always a
It's on
ceramic
the wrong
one.
cadence. You gotta switch cadences.
So let me convince you away from getting a ceramic watch. It does not have any like scratch marks ever on it, which is like a super bummer. When you have a nice polished surface, you want it to accumulate scratch marks, to like show that you're wearing it. Like no scratch marks on the ceramic one. It's a big bummer.
Yeah, that sounds terrible.
and
That's
then
terrible.
And then another big bummer is you scratch a lot of things with it because it turns out the ceramic one is very sharp. So if you brush up against a wall, it will chip the wall. If you brush up against a car, it will chip the car. And
So if
you'll
if
notice
you have a vendetta against someone, that's pretty easy. You just
Yeah.
walk
you'll
by
notice
the car.
because
Oops.
it accumulates in this little like groove right here. You have car paint
Oh.
now, and then you know what you just did. So those are some downsides of the ceramic model. If you needed any to help convince you.
All right.
Well, here, I've got another solution for you, which is be cheap and just get a sticker that looks like it's ceramic. Because I'm a
I need a
poser.
picture of that. I need a picture of that. That's really.
That's
I'll
excellent.
send you one.
Also, doesn't scratch. You just replace the sticker every now.
Exactly. It was like $15, man.
Well, you know what I'm really mad about is that so I have a Series 5. I didn't even get the Series 6. I'm probably going to upgrade to the 7, but like I'm really mad that they always release the cool colors after I've already bought one. So like that happened with the iPhone, the red iPhones for many
Yeah.
generations. I finally got to buy a red iPhone on launch day, except that it's not really red. Like it's the metal
See,
rails
also
are-
the pink
are
IMAX,
red.
right?
Yeah, but it's like more of like a
Oh.
pink peach than it is
Right.
a
That
red.
sucks.
So I just put the red case on it. It's like, well, at that point, I can just get any phone.
Yeah.
But then
The
they
camera
released
hole's red.
they
Well-
released the red watch, but it was released out of cycle, right? It wasn't part of the.
I think
I'm
it
pretty
came
sure.
out with it. They had the
it?
blue one and the red one, and that was like the special
Maybe
thing.
that is right.
I don't.
But I
remember.
wasn't ready to upgrade. It was anyway. The point was, it's like they always bring the red ones out when I'm not ready to upgrade. It's really frustrating. But yeah.
And then I think we all agree on this, but I think I still need to ask: is it just iPhones?
Yes.
Oh, you mean there's no new Mac Pro? Like this is not the Mac Pro event?
I'm just
No,
begging
like
for
that,
it.
they
at this
never do
point.
that. I don't know why people think that that's a thing.
Okay,
Like,
wait. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry,
we
no
had
iPhones, all
this talk.
HomePods.
That's all.
We talked about this like maybe 6+ months ago. Are the new iPhones on the M architecture or are they on the A architecture?
Oh.
A15.
Yeah,
I mean, does it really matter?
it doesn't.
They're the same
It matters
thing.
for
It
the
doesn't
for the
really
podcast,
matter.
Spencer.
It doesn't really matter. That would be really interesting if they brought out the iPhone, what is it, 13, and it was running on the M1 or an M1 variant.
That would not be an improvement though, because it's the same
yeah.
chip as the
Right.
A14.
Yeah, exactly.
or M2 or whatever.
Just
whatever.
say
like-
the A15 is the same performance, has the same performance
Yeah.
as the M1. You're good.
But
You- yeah.
it feels
Why did they even do
different,
that?
right?
Why did they even create a separation like that?
Well,
Why didn't
because
they
it was
just
for the
release-
Mac chip, but then they
Yes.
blurred
Yeah.
that line when they made the iPad
Yeah.
have
But
the
then they
Mac
made the
chip,
iPad.
but
Yeah,
then
I
did
mean-
not update
Yeah.
the iPad to be any more Mac-like. And I think
Right.
that was a huge missed opportunity. Like,
Yeah.
either just use the M1, but call it the A14X. Like, just for marketing, if you don't want to have people be hopeful, and then they won't be hopeful. They'll just be like, cool, it's a new, faster, like, iPad, and it has Thunderbolt. Like, neat. But now it's like such a missed opportunity to have visibly improved the iPad, but they didn't. And now it's
I
like
agree.
a super blurry line. So yeah, why not? The next iPhone has an M2 in it. Like, there's no rhyme or reason at this point.
Right.
Yeah, I guess not.